Welcome to Disciples of Christ History. My name is Steve Regas. I'm a member here at Liberty Christian Church in Liberty, Missouri. I am leading a 15-week series on the history of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I've been asked to say a little bit how this series came about. A few of you may know that I'm currently working on a book called Seeking Christ. It's about the difference between liberal Christians and conservative Christians. In the end, it will suggest at least to find a way to bridge their differences. In working on that book, I recently completed a pretty long chapter on the history of Christianity. The second factor is that Dave Culver, the pastor of this congregation, asked me last summer to teach a series on the history of the disciples of Christ, as there were a fair number of members of this congregation who really weren't aware of that. The third factor came in, and this got the region involved. I'm currently mentoring a candidate for commissioning in the region. And as part of the process, he has to take a class in the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. Unfortunately, there's no really good local option for that. And in speaking with the region, they said if he watches this series, it would fulfill that criteria for him, but they would also like to put it on the regional website for anyone else who wanted to study the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. I am honored to have you as my guest for this, and thank you for being here. Welcome to Disciple History. This is the first of 15 weeks. Part of it depends on how many questions you ask. And some of the sessions I will be lecturing, and some of the sessions will be interactive, that I'll have things for you to do, and I simply don't know how long those are going to last. But I'm assuming this is 15 weeks. This is called BC. Normally, if somebody says BC, what do you think of? Before Christ. Now, in disciple history, let me suggest that BC can mean something else. Before Campbell. Now, most disciple history classes start basically at Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801 with Barton Stone. Or they may start in 1809 in Washington County, Pennsylvania with Thomas Campbell. But there's been 2 centuries of disciple history. But there were 18 centuries of Christian history before our movement began. And to understand who we are, you have to understand where we came from. And so we're going to start not with Barton Stone, not with Alexander Campbell, not with Walter Scott, but we're going to start in Jerusalem when the church was formed. When was that? Conservatives say 33 AD, liberals say 30 AD. 3 years and 2000 is a moot point. But the church started in 30 AD. Now, I have to give you a disclaimer. Some of my class members know that I'm writing a book called Seeking Christ, the difference between liberal and conservative Christians. And some of what I'm doing works out of one of the chapters in that book, so I'll give you that disclaimer. But I do think the history is important. What religion was Jesus? Jewish. What religion was Peter? Jewish. What religion was Paul? On the day of Pentecost, Peter preached and 3,000 souls were added. All of those 3,000 people, what was their religion? They were Jewish. Now, that is an important point for a couple of reasons. What nation were they a part of in 30 or 33 AD? The Roman Empire. How big was the Roman Empire? If you think about the Mediterranean and all the way around it, all of that was the Empire of Rome. It was a large, dispersed, different group of people. Now, we call America a melting pot, and it is. And sometimes trying to govern a melting pot of different people can be difficult. But our melting pot is nothing compared to what they had in Rome. Now, unlike some ancient empires of the past, one thinks of the Babylonians, one thinks of the Assyrians, one thinks of the Greeks, who tried not just to impose their rule, but their culture, their religion on conquered people. The Romans were in many ways very tolerant. If they conquered a nation, the nation could keep its religion. But what the Romans, can anybody tell me among their otherwise lenient attitude what the Romans did not want? They didn't want a new religion. They had more than enough to start with. If they conquered a nation like Judea, and you can say, our religion's been here for 1,000 years. Their response was, that is fine. You can keep your religion. You can do what you want. But we don't want any new religions. And at first, that wasn't much of a problem. Again, Peter was a, Paul was a, John was a Jew, James the Just was a Jew. 100% of Christians were Jews. Now, you don't have to read much of the Bible, the New Testament, to know that within Judaism, there were several different groups. Can anybody name them? Who are the ones that Jesus always railed against? The Pharisees. The Sadducees. Those were the two main ones. And they kind of butted heads against each other. But there were other groups. Anybody know? The Zealots? The Essenes? Now, were those groups legal? To a point. I mean, the Zealots were actively conspiring against Rome, so they weren't happy about that. But as long as a religion was seen as a sect, a group, a subgroup within Judaism, which was a legal religion, they were fine. Now, when Christianity first started, it was 100% Jewish. And if Christianity had simply stayed a subgroup within Judaism, would it have been legal? Yeah. But did it stay a subgroup very long? No. You remember the story of Peter and Cornelius the centurion? This was one of the most important things that happened in the New Testament. To the original apostles, the idea that God's grace would extend beyond God's people, the Jews, was unthinkable. And literally, basically God led Peter by the nose and said, Peter, you're going to do this. And he went to Cornelius, he preached, and when the Spirit fell upon him, he suddenly realized this Jesus thing is a whole lot bigger than we think. And so they began to preach among the Gentiles. Now at first, of course, it was, maybe 95% Jewish, 5% Gentile. But what happened with time? What happened as Paul went through the Roman Empire? How did the balance shift? Became more Gentile. Let me read a passage. This is one of the most important in all of the New Testament. roughly 50 AD, maybe 49 AD, there took place what was called the Jerusalem Conference. And this is when the bigwigs all got together. Paul had been preaching among the Gentiles. And there were Jewish Christians that said, you got to become a Jew if you want to become a Christian. And that would have negated Paul's message. So Paul, Peter, James, John, the leaders of the church, got together in Jerusalem, and this is what happened. Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to obey the law of Moses. The apostles and elders met to consider the question. After much discussion, Peter got up and addressed them. Brothers, you know that some time ago God made a choice among you that the Gentiles might hear from my lips the message of the gospel and believe. God, who knows the heart, showed that they accepted them by the Holy Spirit to them, just as he did to us. I skipped down a ways. And the whole assembly became silent as they listened to Barnabas and Paul tell about the miraculous signs and wonders God had done through the Gentiles. This is James. It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. The decision of the Jerusalem Council, although like lots of political decisions over time, there were some who rebelled against it. But the leaders basically said in 50 AD, Christianity is for everybody, Jew and Gentile alike. And it was after that that Paul began the second and then third missionary journeys, where he went into the European world and began to convert people. And it was at that point the church started becoming predominantly Gentile. And the idea that this was a sect within Judaism was no longer the case. It was a new religion. And what did that make it? Illegal. And at that point, Christianity became illegal. And that's when some of the problems started. Christians became suspect. Now, in our world, if I said, Roger Dusing is a great Christian, it would be true. Would you consider that a compliment? If you lived in 65 AD in the Roman Empire, would saying, hey, they're a Christian, would that be a compliment? Probably not. Why though? Have you ever considered if somebody who knew nothing about, am I roaming too much?
No, you're good.
If somebody who had never been exposed to Christianity, about an hour and 15 minutes from now, walked into our sanctuary, and what do we have, those little hourglass things? And somebody heard the elder at the table say, this is my body broken for you. And what do? And somebody heard, this is my blood shed for you. What would they think?
Crazy.
What?
Crazy.
Another word that begins with C, but a lot worse than crazy.
Cannibals.
Cannibals. People wondered if Christians were not cannibals. And this will sound very odd, but we'll get to this later. Christians were considered to be atheists. Now, how is that possible?
We weren't following their God.
Their God, you know.
What they viewed as their God.
What they, and again, the Romans were pretty lenient. You know, 364, you know, if your God was, say, Baal worship was pretty much gone by then, but I'm using it as an example. If your God was Baal, you could pray to Baal 364 days a year. But as long as you prayed to the emperor as the deification of the spirit of Rome, you were cool. Now again, Jews wouldn't do that. Jews had some special privileges. But if you're an illegal religion who's suspect anyway, and you won't pray to the gods of Rome, you don't believe in the gods of Rome, what does that make you? An atheist. But it makes you something more than that. If you're in a crowd of people and you say the Pledge of Allegiance and somebody doesn't do it, what do you think of them? They're not patriotic. And a pretty strong feeling of disgust, repulsion. If you don't pray to the God of Rome, the emperor, that's literally the equivalent of our day of not saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Rome has given us so much. Rome has given us the Pax Romana, the peace, the wonderful system of roads, a system of justice. And if you won't pray to the emperor one day a year, you're not very patriotic. And that didn't go well for the Christians. Now, there were some exceptions to this. Early on, we know that there were some rich ladies who joined the church. But by and large, who made up the early churches? Rich folks or poor folks? Poor folks. And indeed, it was an interesting situation. You could come into a congregation, I can't get too close, and the elder might be a slave, and the master might be a member. When did the Christians meet? Did they, meet out in the open? Probably. The great liturgical symbol, the fish, ichthos, where did that come from?
They didn't want people to know that they were Christians.
You made that symbol, and if you weren't a part of the flock, hey, you didn't know what it was. It's just somebody making a weird thing in the sand. But if you were a Christian, you understood it. So you had these people who are atheists. They're not patriotic. They're illegal. They may be cannibals. They have poor people, slaves running the show, and they meet in secret. Is it any wonder that they're suspect? Now, Christians rapidly became scapegoats. The first big case of scapegoating was, this has modern correlations. You remember in 1933 when Hitler wanted to take power, he burned the Reichstag, and who did he blame it on? The communists. Folks, if you don't put me in power, the commies will take over, even though he was the one that burned the building. What do ancient leaders want to do? Glorify themselves. And what better way to glorify yourself than build a brand new, beautiful capital? What was the problem with building a new capital of Rome? There was already one there. So Nero burned it so he could rebuild it. But like Hitler, he didn't blame it on himself. Who did he blame it on? The Christians. And that was probably one of the first major persecutions of the Christians. Probably both Peter and Paul died in the Neronian persecution. And it became common after that for Christians to be blamed for everything. There's a great quote. This is a couple generations after Nero. To quote the well-known passage from Tertullian, if the Tiber reaches the walls, if the Nile does not rise to the field, if the sky doesn't move and the earth does, if there's famine, if there's plague, the cry is at once, Christian to the lions, that they were blamed for everything. Now, it wasn't though, and this is the interesting and cruel thing about it. Most of the time in the Roman Empire, as we leave the first century AD, we move into the second century, the hundreds, into the 200s. Most of the time, Christians were not harassed. They may have been looked down on, but typically they weren't harassed. But it's like a lot of things in law. People sometimes do things that aren't legal and get away with it. But if the government wants to make an example out of you, what happens? You pay. And that's how it was for Christians. There's a very fascinating story. Oh, where's it in here? There was a bishop named Polycarp who lived in Smyrna. This is about the middle of the first century, roughly 150, 160. This shows how persecution was sporadic. But if somebody chose to make a point, it could get bad in a hurry. The following memorable scene took place, recorded by a Christian at the time. When he approached the proconsul, the Roman official, asked if he were Polycarp, and when he admitted it, they tried to persuade him to deny, saying, "Respect your age," and so forth, as they are accustomed to say. "Swear by the genius of Caesar, repent, say away with the atheists." But Polycarp, with a stern countenance, looked on all the crowd in the arena, and waving his hand, he groaned and looked up to heaven and said, "Away with the atheists." This is kind of you could say that and not really deny your Christianity. But when the governor pressed him and said, "Take the oath and I will let you go, revile Christ," Polycarp said, "For 86 years I have been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. And how can I blaspheme my king who saved me?" But when he persisted again and said, "Swear by the genius of Caesar," he said, "If you vainly suppose that I will swear by the genius of Caesar as you say, and pretend that you are ignorant of who I am, listen plainly. I am a Christian. And if you wish to learn the doctrine of Christianity, fix a day and listen." Then the proconsul said, "Persuade the people." And Polycarp said, "You I should have held worthy of discussion, for we have been taught to render honor, as is met, if it does not hurt, to princes and authorities before God. But as for those, I do not count them worthy that a defense should be made to them." And the proconsul said, "I have wild beasts. I will deliver to them unless you change your mind." And Polycarp said, "Call for them." And again he said, "I will cause you to be consumed by fire if you despise the beasts, unless you repent." But Polycarp said, "You threaten me with the fire that burns for a time and is quickly quenched. For you do not know the fire that awaits the wicked in the judgment to come." And Polycarp was burned that day. So that kind of is an example. He had lived as a Christian for 86 years, and no one had hassled him. But when somebody wanted to make a point, make an example, Roman justice could fall very rapidly and very severely. The church began roughly 33 AD. For the first 280 years of existence, you only became a Christian for one reason. Have you ever heard stories about people who join the prettiest church in town so their daughter can get married there? I think about our windows, it's like, well, maybe I better not step on toes. In those days, the only reason you became a Christian because you wanted to follow Jesus. There was simply no other reason to. You would be excluded from polite society. You would be suspect. Now, honestly, with time, things started to become a little better. By the 200s, by the 250s, enough people were Christians that Christians started to maybe have churches. But it was still illegal. The first generalized persecution, again, these have all been sporadic, they've been local. The first generalized persecution across the empire took place in 250 AD. The last and biggest great persecution took place about 302 AD and continued on and off for about 12 years. And these were instances where the whole church across the whole empire was persecuted. What did persecution do to Christianity? Now, I see Callan back there. Do we have any other coaches in the room? Well, Megan, any other coaches? Why do you make kids work hard in practice?
Make it better.
To make them better. If you don't use your muscles, what happens? They atrophy. But if you test them, you make it. The saying is, what does not break me makes me stronger. What did persecution do to the church?
Made it stronger.
Made it stronger. It's been said that the seat of the church was the blood of the martyrs. If you look back at the 20th century, the communists who tried to eradicate Christianity were not very smart. Because if they had studied the Romans, they would have realized that the harder you persecute it, the more strong it will become. So in spite of everything, over the first 280 years, Christianity grew. Do we have any questions till now? So, again, this is not a story about Roman Christianity, it's a story about disciple history. So let's talk about what that has to do with churches today. Let's see if I can erase this. Whoops. Well, some of you who are longtime members of the Koinonia class, do you guys recognize this board? This is the one I wrote on for years and years and years upstairs in the nether part of the church. And I guess Troy had a heck of a time this week getting the ink that had been there 10 years dried off. But anyway, my old friend is back. I suppose I could do PowerPoint, but you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Now, different churches work differently. There are basically three kinds of church government, and I'm going to go alphabetically. The first is congregational. Can you think of any churches with congregational government? This ought to be easy. Ours. Can you think of any other churches with congregational government? There's a church about 2 blocks down the street. Baptists have congregational government. And the reason we do that is because when we look in the New Testament, we see a congregational kind of government. Now, the second kind is Episcopal. I probably didn't spell that right, but you get it. What does the word Episcopal mean? Bishop. Bishop. Now, what churches have bishops? Methodists. Episcopalians, obviously. Catholics. To some extent, Lutherans. Orthodox Christians. They have bishops. And just as disciples of Christ look at the New Testament and say, we see our form of government there, what do Catholics say? Well, we look at the New Testament and we see a form of government where there's a bishop and priests and deacons. And that's where we get our form of government. Now there's a third kind of church, polity. What is it? Presbyterian. When we were doing one of the ministry architect seminar, we were sitting in here, and somebody, it was one of the older members, made the comment that he had originally been Presbyterian and talking about the rules, and he goes, "Oh, you can tell the Presbyterians were formed by lawyers," which is true. Calvin was a lawyer. Presbyterian comes from the Greek word presbyter, which means old. You know, when you get bad eyes, it's called presbyopia, because you've got old eyes. In a Presbyterian, and obviously the church that follows this is Presbyterians of all shapes and forms, and there's a lot of them. Presbyterian means elders. In a Presbyterian church, there are two kinds of elders. There are ruling elders, which are lay people, and teaching elders, which are ministers. And in their church, they don't have a board, they have anybody knows what it's called? Session. And the pastor, the teaching elder, presides over the session. But there are bigger groups than that. What's the step above the local church? This should be easy. The presbytery. And I believe in a lot of the churches that you get one lay elder and one teaching elder go there, and then they form kind of a super group that looks over the churches. And above that's a synod, and above that's an assembly. But the idea is that there's a group of presbyters, elders, who rule not just the local church. They do rule the local church, but collectively they rule all the churches. So you've got these three kinds of polity there. In case you're wondering, the polity is P-O-L-I-T-Y. Now, again, if you're a good Presbyterian, you can look at the Bible and say, well, you know, there were elders in the church. We get our polity from the Bible. And every group can look back at the scriptures and say, we can find evidence for how we govern our church in the Bible. Now let me take a break and have a little Coca-Cola. I don't know about you, but I have breakfast with the king. Now for you youngsters, you're used to digital recording. But people of our vintage, remember that about 1975, 1980, the latest, greatest thing in technology was a VCR. You remember VCRs? What were the two types of VCRs? The two systems. Beta and VHS. And how many of you had a beta? Everybody had a VHS. Anybody have a beta? Who won out? VHS. But they were both valid systems at the time, but one, through the market, won out. Everybody can look back and say, well, I see my congregational form as being the original form. And people can say, I see the Episcopal form being the original form. Or I see the Presbyterian form being the original form. Who's right and who's wrong? It's like Betamax and VHS. They were all probably in effect at the same time. Which one won out? Episcopal. Basically from 100 AD to about 1517 AD. Now why? A couple things. part of it is language. What is the synonym? Same name. Can you give me an example of a synonym?
Chilly and cold.
What? Chilly and cold. Okay. The biggest difference. Now, congregational churches like ours, we have elders and we have deacons. And in most cases, I think we would probably consider the minister a form of elder. And Presbyterians have elders and they have deacons. And Episcopal churches have bishops, they have ministers, elders or priests, and they have deacons. The whole question is, see if I can get the word right in Greek. Does episcopi equal press do those words mean the same thing? And if you're Presbyterian, they do. If you're a disciple, they do. If you're Catholic, they don't. And the difficulty is that, again, language is open to interpretation. Now, but the question is, why did this form win out? There's an old saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks a lot like a nail. What's the other saying that a giraffe was a committee designed to design a horse? First point, if you are under persecution, if you're stressed, if things are difficult, is it easier to refer things to a committee or have one strong leader who can respond? One leader. We are Americans. We have freedom of religion. We have a board. We have a plethora of committees. We have elders. We have deacons. We have trustees. We can do that. But if the church is persecuted, what do they need? A bishop. Somebody who can stand up and say, this is how it is. And actually, if you think about the Roman Catholic Church during communism, Pope John Paul II, when he was still Karol Wojtyła, the Bishop of Krakow, do you remember when the government would crack down? He was the one that would respond and rally people. When you're in a persecuted situation, having one leader may be great, but there's something else. We have a congregational government. When did the disciples form? When did Stone and Campbell work? In the early 1800s in America. What was our form of government? A representative democracy. Is it any surprise that our church became a representative democracy? A church that grew up in the Roman Empire where you had an all-powerful emperor and governors, and it was a strict control. Is it any shock that the church that came out of that was the same thing? So, a little bit of history, how maybe an Episcopal system evolved. And certainly when Campbell and Stone read the New Testament, as good Americans, and you know, Stone was the only native-born American, the others were immigrants. They saw as Americans the congregational way, voting. That was the way you run a church. And that's kind of how we came up with this. But what they were wrong about is that other churches could look back and say, we can get ours, we can find ours also. Because they were probably all three happening at the same time. And because of the situation, it's like VHS beating Betamax, Or if you go back 100 years, the war of the currents between Westinghouse and Edison, AC went out over DC. This, because of the situation, won out. Any questions so far? Let's talk about one or two other things. How do disciples of Christ baptize people? Immersion. It's interesting that what religion was Barton W. Stone to start with? He was Presbyterian. What was Thomas Campbell? What was Alexander Campbell? They were Presbyterian. Now, they became Baptists for about 15 years, and they found themselves unwanted within Baptist circles. But I forget the year. Alexander Campbell and his wife had a little girl. And that caused them, having grown up as Presbyterian, having been baptized as infants, to look back on the scriptures. Because after all, this was a back to the Bible movement. And the more they thought about it, the more they began to question if infant baptism was the correct form of baptism. Now, as they looked, this is a great story. You know, the best learning is when you make a mistake. When I was in seminary, in disciple history, there actually was a question on the test, who baptized Alexander Campbell? And I got it wrong. The answer is a man named Matthias Luce. I've never forgotten that since. How long does Dave preach on a Sunday morning, would you say? 20 minutes? If Dave preached 30 minutes here and then, would we be upset? Probably not. If Dave went an hour, particularly if the Chiefs were kicking off at 12:05, would we be upset? If Dave preached 3 hours, would we be upset? If Dave preached 5 hours, would we be upset? When Alexander and Thomas Campbell, after their extensive study of the scriptures, came to the conclusion that they needed to be rebaptized by immersion, before they did it, before they found Matthias Luce, the Baptist minister, to do it, they had to explain to the world why they were taking this step. Any idea how long they preached? 7 hours. 7 hours. Actually, when we get later into this, do you know who the most famous pastor of Liberty Christian Church was? Moses Lard. Moses Lard could probably, he was the Fred Craddock of the 1850s. But unlike Fred Craddock, Moses usually went about 2 hours. So, it's not 7 hours. But infant baptism versus adult baptism. If you read the New Testament, what is the correct form?
John the Baptist did immersion.
We're talking about two things. We're talking about the form of baptism, which the form of baptism which was immersion, which was pretty much universal at that point. But beyond that, who you baptized? Do you baptize believers or do you baptize babies? And again, this was what Thomas and Alexander Campbell in their 7-hour sermon were trying to elucidate. What was the biblical pattern? Any ideas? Adults. Again, though, like this, it's clear as mud. Now, for the most part, it is adult. And you cannot prove infant baptism till much later. But this is a classic thing. This is from Acts, Paul's second missionary journey. His first big chance to preach in the continent of Europe is at Philippi in Greece. You remember he gets arrested, they get thrown in jail, and this is what happens. The crowd, this is Acts 16, the crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten. And after they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. Upon receiving such orders, he put them in an inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly there was a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once all the prison doors were open and everyone's chains were loose. Now again, in those days, if a prison guard let the prisoners free, he was executed. The jailer woke up and then he saw the prison doors open. He drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners were escaped. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself. We are all here." And that obviously made a huge impact. The jailer called for the lights, rushed in and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He brought them out and asked them, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, you and your household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and all the others in his house. And at that hour of the night, the jailer immediately, he and his family were baptized. Traditional disciple interpretation, no one under 12. No one under 12 there. You think I'm being facetious. That really is the traditional disciple interpretation. But if you were Presbyterian or Catholic or Methodist, what would you say? Well, they baptized everybody, babies and all. So what's the correct form? Believer's baptism or infant baptism? The testimony of the New Testament is, other than this and a few other passages, is strongly in favor of believer's baptism. If you look at the history, in 150 AD, roughly, the idea of infant baptism was unknown. By 250 AD, that was how it was done. But the thing that really sealed it, St. Augustine lived in the 5th century AD. He came up with the idea of original sin. When you're born, in Augustine ideas, are you pure or are you a sinner? You're a sinner. And as a sinner, if you die, and a whole lot of babies died then, could you see God? No. So what did you need to do as soon as the baby was born? Baptize him. And you know, in a Catholic hospital, what do they do when a baby's born and they think they're going to die? They baptize them. Interestingly, in the Roman Catholic Church, who can baptize? Anybody. Anybody. You don't need to be a priest, you don't need to be a bishop. Anybody can baptize. But in the early times, believers' baptism by immersion was pretty much the standard course. But again, it's kind of like, is Christmas ever mentioned in the Bible? Christmas trees. Would you want to give up Christmas? No. Christmas has been around since about 336 AD. 17 centuries. And we don't want to give that up. Well, infant baptism has been around since 250. So in churches where that's practiced, even if it's not necessarily in the Bible, are you going to give up 1,750 years of tradition? No. And maybe that's what one of the things that made Campbell so much different. Indeed, and we'll get to this later when we get to the Reformation. The word Baptist is actually short for Anabaptist, which means baptized again. And long before we came along, several hundred years before we came along, the first Anabaptists who read the same passages as Campbell and said, adult baptism is what we need. They were living not in a democracy, but in a form of Christendom where the government and the church were pretty close. And we'll talk more about that next week. When Luther and Zwingli and Calvin realized that there were Anabaptists, people who believed in immersion of adults amongst their churches, what did they do? There's a really symbolic way to take care of these people. Anybody know what it is? Drown them. That's what they did. You want to be baptized? Fine. We will baptize you for good. That's what happened. Read about it. So, other than a few of the youngsters here, most of us grew up during the Cold War. And it was the United States and the Soviet Union. And we fought them in Korea, we fought them in Vietnam. But there were hundreds of other places where there was an ideological battle going on. And if you lived in, most of us lived through, I lived through it, I don't remember, the Cuban Missile Crisis. At that point, when Kennedy and Khrushchev are at the brink of nuclear war, could you ever imagine the Berlin Wall falling? And you remember does anybody know the story? One of the polar bears at the zoo is named Berlin. Do you know why she has that name? She was born in 1989, and she was named after the wall falling. Tidbit. But remember when it happened? It was such a shock. Remember when the Soviet Union fell on Christmas of 1991? What a shock it was. You couldn't have imagined that. There have been other shocks, positive. I mean, it's incredibly, of all the bad things that happened in our life, that was one of the greatest. We're going to talk about a seminal moment like that happened. We're going to talk about that next week. Again, the first 280 years of the church existence, 277 if you're a fundamentalist, but again, that point's neither here or there. The church was about persecution, period. And the only reason you became a Christian is because you wanted to follow Jesus. Then, like the Berlin Wall falling in November of 1989, something happened that nobody could have believed. We'll get to that next week.